The fear arrived before the replacement did. Most people experiencing it describe it as irrational, a vague dread about something that hasn't happened yet, attached to a technology they can't fully evaluate. That description is wrong. The fear is not irrational. It is a calibrated biological response to a structural condition. The organism has correctly identified that its survival architecture is being dismantled, and the nervous system is doing precisely what it was designed to do. This is not anxiety about the future. This is the body processing a present-tense threat. The threat has a specific shape. It is not a single disruption event, a layoff, a restructuring, a market collapse. Those the nervous system can process. They have edges. They produce acute stress that resolves. What AI displacement produces is different. A chronic, ambient, boundaryless signal that professional value is depreciating in real time, with no ceiling on how far that depreciation can go, and no action available that would stop it. The nervous system was not built to handle that signal. Researchers at the University of Florida have begun documenting what they call AI-Induced Relevance Disorder, a clinical pattern characterized by chronic anxiety, sleep disruption, identity fragmentation, and a pervasive sense of professional futility. The organism knows, without being told explicitly, that the system it organized its survival around is no longer organizing around it. Most people call this overreaction. It is not overreaction. The HPA axis does not distinguish between a predator in the environment and a structural shift in the labor market. Both register as threat. Both activate cortisol. Both narrow the cognitive field toward the single question the nervous system is designed to answer: what is the path to safety? When no path exists, when the threat is systemic rather than specific, the HPA axis does not stand down. It continues producing the same signal. The organism remains in a state of chronic activation with no resolution available. That is not anxiety disorder. That is the correct output of a system encountering an unresolvable input. The cognitive narrowing that follows is not a psychological weakness. Daniel Kahneman's framework for cognitive bandwidth under pressure describes what happens when System 2, the deliberate analytical function, is persistently taxed by threat processing. It contracts. The organism defaults to System 1, fast, heuristic, pattern matching. Under sustained AI displacement anxiety, this means the worker stops evaluating their actual skills and starts running a single, exhausting loop. Am I replaceable? The answer the system keeps returning is possibly. And the loop does not close. 70% of American workers report increased financial stress linked to inflation. 56% report active concern about AI's impact on their specific role. These are not isolated anxieties. They are population-level signals that a significant portion of the workforce is operating under simultaneous financial and existential threat. Two activation systems running concurrently with no resolution available to either. The cognitive result is predictable. The organism cannot optimize, it can only brace. What the adaptation costs is more precise than it first appears. The nervous system under chronic threat does not simply become anxious, it reorganizes. Threat detection becomes the primary cognitive allocation. Robert Sapolsky's work on chronic stress biology is specific on this point. Sustained cortisol exposure does not just impair higher-order thinking, it physically remodels the structures responsible for it. The prefrontal cortex, which manages long-range planning, risk evaluation, and identity construction, loses functional density. The amygdala, which processes immediate threat, gains it. The worker who cannot think clearly about their career trajectory is not lacking discipline. They are operating on hardware that has been structurally reprioritized by the conditions the system created. The trade-off is architectural. The organism sacrifices its capacity to plan the future in order to survive the present. Under acute, short-term threat, this is an efficient exchange. Under chronic, systemic, unresolvable threat, which is precisely what AI displacement produces, the organism depletes its planning capacity continuously, while the threat that triggered the depletion remains constant. The system keeps asking the organism to navigate a complex future. The organism's navigation hardware keeps getting consumed by the present. This is not a failure to adapt. This is adaptation functioning exactly as designed, in an environment that was not designed to be survived. The behavioral patterns this produces are not symptoms. They are outputs. The worker begins hoarding professional credentials, acquiring certifications, skills, and qualifications, not because they have a coherent development strategy, but because credential accumulation is the only form of threat response the environment makes available. The action provides the sensation of agency without resolving the underlying signal. Sleep becomes fragmented. Not because the individual is catastrophizing, but because the threat processing system does not distinguish between waking and sleeping states. The amygdala continues running its evaluation cycle. The body remains partially activated. Deep sleep requires the nervous system to release vigilance. Under sustained occupational threat, it does not. Professional identity begins to detach from role performance. The worker does the job while simultaneously monitoring whether the job will exist. Attention splits between execution and obsolescence tracking. Neither receives full cognitive allocation. Social withdrawal accelerates in environments where peers are perceived as competing for the same diminishing resource. The behavioral immune system, the cluster of cognitive adaptations designed to reduce exposure to threat, begins classifying professional community as threat vector rather than support structure. Isolation increases. Information about displacement accelerates. The loop tightens. Emotional flatness develops, not as depression in the clinical sense, but as a conservation strategy. Emotional response requires metabolic resources. The organism under chronic activation begins rationing. What appears externally as detachment or numbness is the system executing a resource allocation decision. Risk aversion calcifies. Under conditions where professional value appears to be depreciating regardless of action taken, the organism stops initiating. New projects, new roles, new approaches all register as potential acceleration of loss rather than potential gain. The organism that was once a capable risk-taker becomes structurally risk-averse, not because its personality changed, but because its threat calculus changed. The individual did not become more fearful. The environment became more threatening, and the organism updated accordingly. Systems do not produce uniform behavioral outputs by accident. When a pattern appears simultaneously across millions of individuals, credential hoarding, sleep fragmentation, identity detachment, social withdrawal, emotional conservation, risk calcification, the pattern is no longer psychiatric. It is environmental. The environment selected for these behaviors because they are the correct adaptations to the conditions it created. AI displacement anxiety is not a wave of collective irrationality. It is a population-level nervous system response to a structural condition that the labor market introduced and the individual cannot resolve. The University of Florida is documenting it as a clinical phenomenon. It is not a clinical phenomenon. It is a feedback loop between a technological shift and a biological system that was never designed to process obsolescence at scale. The fear arrived before the replacement did, because the system that produces the replacement also produces the signal that the replacement is coming. The nervous system receives that signal correctly. It responds correctly. The organism spends its cognitive resources processing a threat it cannot survive, cannot escape, and cannot ignore. The system continues. The organism adapts to the system continuing. That is not anxiety. That is architecture.